There are weapons that simply do their job. And then there are weapons that become legends. The Colt M1911 pistol is one of those rare firearms that transcended its original purpose to become an icon of American military history. For over 70 years, this pistol served as the standard-issue sidearm for United States Armed Forces, seeing action in 2 world wars, Korea, Vietnam, and countless other conflicts. It earned the trust of soldiers, the respect of enemies, and a permanent place in the history of warfare. But what made this particular pistol so special? Why did it remain in frontline service for so much longer than most weapons of its era? The answer lies not just in its mechanical excellence, but in the desperate circumstances that drove its creation, the genius of its designer, and the countless battlefields where it proved its worth when lives hung in the balance. The M1911 wasn't created in a laboratory by engineers working from theory. It was born from blood and necessity, from hard lessons learned in brutal combat where American soldiers died because their weapons failed them. It was perfected by a man whose understanding of firearms bordered on supernatural, who could envision mechanisms and systems that other designers couldn't comprehend. And it was proven in every major American conflict of the 20th century, carried by millions of soldiers who knew that when everything else failed, they could trust the .45 pistol on their hip. This weapon has fired countless rounds in anger across continents and oceans. It has saved lives in desperate last stands and provided reassurance to soldiers heading into combat. It has been praised by generals and cherished by enlisted men. It has been copied, studied, and admired by firearms designers around the world. And more than a century after its creation, it remains one of the most respected and widely used pistols on Earth. This is the story of the Colt M1911, a weapon born from necessity, perfected through innovation, and proven in the crucible of combat. This is the story of the pistol that became an American legend. To understand the M1911, we must first travel back to the closing years of the 19th century, to a conflict that most Americans have forgotten, but one that would change military history forever. The Philippine-American War that erupted in 1899 became a brutal testing ground for American weapons. And it exposed a fatal flaw in the military's standard sidearm that would cost American lives and force a complete rethinking of what a combat pistol needed to be. American soldiers in the Philippines carried the Colt Model 1892 revolver, chambered in .38 long Colt. On paper, it seemed adequate. The revolver was well made, accurate, and reliable. It had served adequately in previous conflicts. But in the jungles and villages of the Philippines, against an enemy unlike any American forces had previously encountered, the .38 caliber revolver proved woefully inadequate. And soldiers paid the price with their lives. Filipino Moro warriors, fighting with fanatical determination and often under the influence of drugs that dulled their sensitivity to pain, would charge American positions with terrifying ferocity. These weren't ordinary combatants. They were men who had worked themselves into a religious frenzy, who believed that dying in battle against foreign invaders would grant them paradise. They felt no fear. They acknowledged no pain. And they would not stop coming until they were physically incapable of continuing the fight. American soldiers would empty their revolvers into attacking Moros, watching in horror as the .38 caliber rounds failed to stop their advance. They would hit their targets center mass, shots that should have dropped any man, and watched those same targets continue charging with knives and bolos raised high. Men died because their weapons lacked stopping power. They died not because they missed, not because they hesitated, but because the bullets from their service revolvers simply couldn't deliver enough energy to immediately incapacitate a determined attacker. The military conducted extensive tests after these incidents. They shot livestock. They studied wound ballistics. They interviewed survivors of attacks. The conclusion was undeniable. The United States military needed a more powerful sidearm. They needed a pistol that could stop a charging enemy with one well-placed shot. The era of the .38 caliber service revolver was over. The answer would come from a man who many consider the greatest firearms designer who ever lived, John Moses Browning. Born in 1855 in Ogden, Utah, Browning had been designing innovative firearms since his teenage years. He grew up in his father's gun shop, where he absorbed lessons about firearms design that most engineers never learn in a lifetime. By the time he was a young man, he was already creating weapons that established manufacturers wanted to produce. By the turn of the century, Browning had already created some of the most successful weapons in American history. The Winchester Model, 1886 lever-action rifle. The Auto 5, the first successful semi-automatic shotgun. The M1895 machine gun, nicknamed the Potato Digger for its unusual operating mechanism. But the M1911 would become his masterpiece. The weapon that would cement his reputation as perhaps the finest firearms designer in history. Browning's genius lay not just in his mechanical skill, but in his understanding of what a combat weapon truly needed to be. He didn't start by designing a pistol and then finding ammunition for it. He started by designing ammunition that could do the job the military needed done, and then built a pistol around that cartridge. The result was the .45 automatic Colt pistol, or .45 ACP. This round was a revelation. The large, slow-moving bullet, measuring .45 inches in diameter, delivered devastating stopping power. Unlike high-velocity rounds that might pass through a target without transferring all their energy, the .45 ACP was designed to dump massive kinetic energy into whatever it hit. A hit from a .45 didn't just wound. It immediately incapacitated. It dropped attackers in their tracks. It was exactly what American soldiers had needed in the Philippines. But stopping power alone wasn't enough. Browning created a pistol that was reliable, accurate, and simple to maintain under combat conditions. The M1911 used a revolutionary short recoil operating system. When fired, the barrel and slide remained locked together and moved rearward for a short distance. Then the barrel unlocked and stopped while the slide continued backward, ejecting the spent cartridge case. A recoil spring then drove the slide forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. The barrel locked up again, and the pistol was ready to fire. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second. This system was so well designed that it became the template for countless pistols that followed. Even today, more than a century later, most semi-automatic pistols use operating systems that are variations on Browning's original design. He had created something so fundamentally sound, so perfectly engineered, that it couldn't be significantly improved upon. The military ran extensive trials. Browning's pistol competed against designs from other manufacturers, enduring grueling tests designed to find any weakness. The pistols were fired thousands of times without cleaning. They were soaked in water, caked with mud, frozen and heated. They were dropped, kicked, and abused in ways that would destroy lesser weapons. And through it all, Browning's design kept working. In March of 1911, the United States Army formally adopted Browning's design, designating it the Model of 1911, or M1911. Production began immediately at Colt's Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut. The military had found its weapon. Now it needed a war to prove it. That war would come soon enough, and when it did, the M1911 would prove itself beyond anyone's wildest expectations. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the M1911 went to war with American doughboys crossing the Atlantic. The pistol was only 6 years old, relatively untested in large-scale combat, and there were questions about how it would perform in the unprecedented conditions of industrial warfare. The trenches of the Western Front would provide the ultimate test for Browning's creation, and the pistol would prove its worth in the most brutal fighting humanity had yet witnessed. Trench warfare created unique combat situations where the M1911 excelled in ways that rifles and machine guns could not. In the close quarters of trenches, communication tunnels, and bunkers, rifles were too long and cumbersome. A soldier navigating the narrow confines of a trench couldn't effectively wield a weapon that was over 3 feet long. But the M1911, at just 8.25 inches overall, was perfectly sized for these claustrophobic battlefields. It became the weapon of choice for raiders, scouts, and officers, leading men over the top into no man's land. The pistol's 7-round magazine, plus 1 round in the chamber, gave soldiers 8 chances to stop an enemy in an environment where a split second could mean the difference between life and death. And unlike the revolvers that some officers still carried from previous conflicts, the M1911 could be reloaded rapidly by simply dropping the empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one. In the chaos of trench fighting, that speed was invaluable. American soldiers quickly learned to trust the M1911 in situations where their lives depended on it. During trench raids, small groups of soldiers would slip across no man's land in the darkness, infiltrate enemy trenches, and engage in brutal close-quarters combat. In those situations, the M1911 was often the difference between success and disaster. A raider clearing a German bunker couldn't afford a weapon that might jam or fail. The .45 pistol gave them confidence that when they pulled the trigger, the weapon would fire. Sergeant Alvin York, who would become America's most decorated soldier of World War I, carried an M1911 during his legendary action in the Argonne Forest on October 8, 1918. York, a sharp-shooting Tennessee mountain man, was part of a patrol that was pinned down by German machine gun fire. After his rifle jammed during the firefight, York drew his M1911 and used it to shoot several German soldiers who charged his position with fixed bayonets. York later described the engagement in vivid detail. The Germans, realizing that the machine guns were being picked off by York's accurate rifle fire, organized a bayonet charge to overrun his position. As they rushed toward him, York drew his pistol and shot them one by one, starting from the rear of the charging group and working forward. His reasoning was tactical. If he shot the men in front first, those behind would see their comrades fall and might take cover. By shooting from the rear forward, each man who fell was blocked from the view of those ahead, and they kept coming. The M1911's stopping power dropped each attacker before they could reach him. York would later credit the pistol with saving his life that day. But it wasn't just in individual heroics that the M1911 proved itself. Officers across the American Expeditionary Force came to trust the weapon implicitly. Unlike many of the quickly produced wartime weapons that jammed, misfired, or broke under combat stress, the M1911 just worked. Covered in mud from the trenches, soaked in the perpetual rain of the Western Front, caked with the grime and filth that was an inescapable part of trench warfare, the pistol continued to function. Soldiers cleaned them when they could, but even when neglected for days or weeks, the M1911 remained reliable. That reliability became legendary. The pistol's accuracy also impressed combat veterans. Unlike the snub-nosed revolvers that many soldiers had carried in previous conflicts, the M1911's 5-inch barrel and excellent sights allowed trained shooters to hit targets at ranges that seemed impossible for a handgun. Reports came back from the front of soldiers making accurate shots at 50 yards or more with the .45. While most pistol engagements happened at much closer ranges, knowing that the weapon was capable of accurate fire at distance gave soldiers confidence in any situation. Tank crews, a new branch of warfare born in World War I, adopted the M1911 as their primary weapon. Inside the cramped confines of early tanks, rifles were impossible to use. If a tank was disabled and the crew had to bail out in hostile territory, they needed a weapon that was compact but powerful. The M1911 fit that requirement perfectly. Tankers would often carry 2 pistols, one on each hip, knowing that if they had to fight their way back to friendly lines, those .45s were their only chance. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the M1911 had earned its reputation. It had proven itself in the hell of trench warfare, in raids across no man's land, in desperate hand-to-hand fighting in captured trenches and bunkers. The soldiers who carried it knew they could trust their lives to John Browning's design. Officers who had commanded men in combat reported that the M1911 never let them down. But the pistol's greatest test was still to come in a war even more terrible than the first. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the M1911 was already 30 years old. Many weapons from World War I had been replaced by modern designs. The bolt-action Springfield rifle had given way to the semi-automatic M1 Garand. New machine guns, new aircraft, new tanks, all represented the latest in military technology. But the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps all retained the .45 pistol as their standard sidearm. That decision would prove to be absolutely correct in the brutal island fighting of the Pacific War. The Pacific Theater created combat conditions that seemed specifically designed to showcase the M1911's strengths. Jungle warfare on islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima meant fighting at point-blank range in dense vegetation where visibility was measured in feet, not yards. The thick jungle canopy blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight where enemies could be hiding just a few steps away. In that environment, soldiers needed a weapon that was compact, powerful, and absolutely reliable. The M1911 was all three. Japanese defenders, trained in Bushido philosophy and ordered to fight to the death rather than surrender, would launch banzai charges and infiltration attacks that brought combat down to its most primitive and terrifying level. These weren't tactical advances designed to seize objectives. They were human wave attacks meant to overwhelm American positions through sheer fanaticism and numbers. Japanese soldiers would charge through machine gun fire, through artillery barrages, accepting horrific casualties to close with American forces in hand-to-hand combat. Marines especially came to love the M1911 in these situations. During night infiltration attacks, Japanese soldiers would slip through American lines in the darkness, trying to reach command posts, artillery positions, and supply depots. They moved silently, often crawling on their stomachs, armed with bayonets and swords. When they were discovered, the resulting combat was desperate and close range. In those situations, the M1911's stopping power became a lifeline for American defenders. A Marine Corps lieutenant on Guadalcanal reported firing his M1911 into attacking Japanese soldiers at ranges so close he could see their faces in the muzzle flash. He described the surreal experience of combat at arm's length, where there was no time to think, only to react. Every round dropped an attacker. There was no second-guessing, no wondering if the target was really down. The 45 ACP did its job with brutal efficiency. The lieutenant survived the war and kept his M1911 for the rest of his life, refusing to ever part with the weapon that had saved him. The famous battle for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in October 1942 saw some of the most intense banzai charges of the war. Japanese forces launched repeated attacks against Marine positions, sometimes sending hundreds of men in mass charges. Marines fired rifles, machine guns, and threw grenades. But when the Japanese reached the American lines, it often came down to pistols and entrenching tools in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. After the battle, Marines found their M1911 so fouled with burned powder and debris that they could barely function, yet the pistols had continued firing throughout the engagement. But the M1911 proved equally valuable in another role that became crucial in the Pacific. As a weapon for vehicle crews, paratroopers, and support personnel who needed a sidearm but couldn't carry a full-size rifle. Tank crews fighting across the islands carried M1911s as their primary weapon when they had to abandon disabled vehicles. The last thing a tanker wanted was to be caught outside his tank with nothing but a pistol. But if that situation arose, they wanted that pistol to be a .45. Pilots shot down over enemy territory carried the M1911 as their only means of defense during evasion and escape. There are numerous accounts of downed pilots using their pistols to fight their way to safety, or to resist capture long enough for rescue forces to reach them. The compact, powerful weapon gave these airmen a fighting chance when they found themselves alone in hostile territory. Some pilots carried 2 M1911s, reasoning that if they went down, they wanted maximum firepower available. One of the most famous uses of the M1911 in World War II came from Colonel John W. Thomason, a Marine officer and combat veteran who wrote extensively about the pistol. He described how Marines would test fire their .45s before combat operations, not just to confirm they worked, but to remind themselves of the weapon's power. The bark of the .45 and the kick in their hands was a psychological reassurance that they carried a real fight stopper. It was a ritual, almost superstitious, but it gave Marines confidence heading into combat. General George S. Patton, known for his ivory-handled revolvers, actually had those revolvers chambered in .45 caliber. Despite his preference for the classic look of a revolver, Patton was a practical soldier who understood ballistics. He considered the .45 caliber to be the minimum acceptable for a combat sidearm, and he frequently stated that the M1911 was the finest combat pistol ever designed. Coming from a general known for his strong opinions and tactical brilliance, that was high praise indeed. By the end of World War II, approximately 2.7 million M1911 pistols had been produced by various manufacturers to meet military demand. Colt couldn't produce them fast enough, so contracts went to Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch and Signal, and Singer Sewing Machine Company. Despite coming from different factories, all the pistols were built to the same exacting specifications, and they were all reliable. The pistols served on D-Day, where paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped into Normandy with M1911s strapped to their sides. When those paratroopers were scattered across the French countryside in the darkness, cut off from their units and surrounded by German forces, many of them survived initial encounters because of the .45 pistol on their hip. It served in North Africa, where Patton's tank crews carried them across the desert. It served in Italy, in the island-hopping campaigns, in every theater where American forces fought. And everywhere it went, the M1911 performed exactly as John Browning had designed it to perform 30 years earlier. The M1911 didn't retire when World War II ended. While many nations rushed to adopt new pistol designs in the post-war years, often choosing higher capacity 9mm pistols that reflected lessons learned in the war, the United States military saw no reason to replace a weapon that had proven itself so completely. The .45 pistol continued as the standard-issue sidearm through Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1980s, an unprecedented run for any military weapon. In Korea, soldiers fighting in frozen mountains and brutal winter conditions found that the M1911 continued to function in temperatures that caused other weapons to fail. The simple, robust design needed no special winterization or cold weather modifications. When temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 degrees below zero, weapons with more complex mechanisms would freeze solid. But the M1911, with its relatively simple operating system and loose tolerances, kept working. GIs would keep the pistols inside their parkas to prevent the oil from freezing, carrying them against their bodies, where body heat would keep the metal and lubricants at a workable temperature. But once warmed even slightly, the weapons fired without hesitation. After firefights in the cold, soldiers reported that their M1911s were sometimes the only weapons that remained functional. Rifles jammed, machine guns froze, but the .45 pistol kept shooting. The brutal combat of the Korean War, with its seesawing front lines and close-quarters fighting in mountainous terrain, proved once again that the M1911's stopping power was not just a theoretical advantage. Chinese and North Korean forces often launched massed infantry attacks, accepting massive casualties to overwhelm United Nations positions. American soldiers fighting off these attacks at close range relied on the M1911 when their rifles ran dry or jammed. The pistol's reputation only grew stronger. Vietnam brought entirely new challenges. The humid jungle environment, with its constant rain and oppressive heat, caused many weapons to rust and corrode at an alarming rate. Weapons that weren't meticulously maintained would deteriorate rapidly in the Vietnamese climate. But properly maintained M1911s soldiered on, proving once again that Browning's design could handle whatever conditions combat threw at it. Special Forces operators and helicopter crews particularly valued the pistol in Vietnam. Door gunners on Huey helicopters kept M1911s strapped to their sides as backup weapons. If their M60 machine guns jammed during a hot landing zone, or if the helicopter was shot down and they had to fight their way to safety, that .45 pistol was their insurance policy. A famous photograph from the war shows a door gunner on a Huey with an M1911 clearly visible in a shoulder holster, ready for use in a split second. Navy SEALs operating in the Mekong Delta and coastal regions carried M1911s on riverine operations. The pistol's reliability in wet conditions made it ideal for operations where weapons might be immersed in water. SEALs reported that they could swim with their M1911s, emerge from the water, and the pistol would fire immediately without needing to be cleared or dried. That kind of reliability was priceless in combat, but by the 1970s and early 80s, pressure was building to replace the M1911. The pistol was over 70 years old. Many of the M1911s in military service had been produced during World War II and had seen decades of hard use. While they remained reliable, they were worn. Additionally, military planners wanted a pistol with higher magazine capacity, something that could hold 15 rounds instead of 7. They also wanted standardization with NATO allies, most of whom had adopted 9mm pistols. It wasn't until 1985 that the United States military officially replaced the M1911 with the Beretta M9, a 9mm pistol that offered higher magazine capacity and was easier for smaller-statured soldiers to handle. The M9 held 15 rounds in its magazine, more than double the M1911's capacity. It was also lighter and had less recoil, making it easier to shoot accurately for soldiers with less training. But the transition was deeply controversial. Many combat veterans protested the decision, arguing that the 9mm lacked the stopping power that had made the .45 so effective. They pointed to the M1911's combat record, to 74 years of reliable service, to the countless soldiers whose lives had been saved by the pistol's ability to drop an enemy with one shot. They argued that magazine capacity was meaningless if you needed 3 or 4 hits to achieve the same effect as one .45 caliber round. The debate continues to this day. Even in the modern military, special operations units often choose to carry modernized versions of the M1911 instead of standard-issue pistols. Marine Corps Special Operations Command, Army Special Forces, and other elite units have adopted custom-built M1911s chambered in .45 ACP, reasoning that when your life is on the line, stopping power matters more than magazine capacity. The M1911's influence extends far beyond its military service. The pistol spawned an entire industry of custom gunsmiths and manufacturers producing improved versions of Browning's original design. Companies like Wilson Combat, Les Bayer, and Ed Brown build custom M1911s that can cost several $1,000s, incorporating modern materials and manufacturing techniques while maintaining the fundamental design that Browning created over a century ago. Competition shooters discovered that the M1911's accuracy and crisp trigger made it ideal for practical shooting sports. The pistol dominates certain categories of competitive shooting, with shooters choosing the M1911 for its inherent accuracy and the confidence that comes from shooting a weapon with over a century of proven performance. Police departments adopted it for SWAT teams and tactical units, knowing that in high-stakes situations, the .45's stopping power could make the difference. Citizens bought them for personal defense, knowing they were getting a weapon with a proven combat record. The M1911 became one of the most popular pistols in American history for civilian ownership, with millions sold over the decades. Gun enthusiasts collect them, customize them, and compete with them. The M1911 has become more than just a weapon. It has become an icon of American firearms design. John Moses Browning passed away in 1926, but his masterpiece outlived him by decades. and continues to be produced and carried today, more than a century after its adoption. The M1911 remains one of the most popular pistols in America, with dozens of manufacturers producing everything from faithful reproductions of the original military model to highly customized competition guns worth thousands of dollars. What makes the M1911 truly legendary isn't just its mechanical excellence or its longevity. It's the fact that for 3 generations of American servicemen, this was the pistol they trusted with their lives. It was there in the trenches of World War I, where soldiers fought in conditions that seemed designed to destroy any weapon. It was there on the beaches of Normandy and in the jungles of the Pacific, where Marines and soldiers faced enemies who would fight to the death. It was there in the frozen mountains of Korea and the steaming jungles of Vietnam. Through all of it, through every conflict and every condition, the M1911 performed. In the end, the Colt M1911 represents something more than just a weapon. It represents American ingenuity, reliability, and the idea that if you design something right the first time, it doesn't need to be replaced. John Browning created a pistol in 1911 that was so fundamentally sound, so perfectly engineered for its purpose, that it remained the standard for 74 years. That's not just impressive, that's legendary. Today, when you see an M1911 in a gun shop or at a shooting range, you're looking at more than a century of history. You're looking at the pistol that won 2 world wars, that saved countless American lives, and that became an enduring symbol of American military power. You're looking at a weapon that served faithfully through conflicts across 6 decades, that earned the trust of millions of soldiers, and that continues to be respected and used by military personnel, law enforcement, and civilians around the world. You're looking at John Moses Browning's masterpiece. You're looking at a legend that will never die.